עכשיו מה שנשאר זה רק לשוחח. בסדר? עכשיו, איך נעשה את זה? אני מבקש, האמת היא שאם אתם תיקחו את המושכות ותשוחחו ביניכם, אני ארגיש מאוד שמח אם לא תשמעו למה שאני רוצה לומר עכשיו. אני עושה את זה מתוך הנחה שאתם תהיו קשים איתי, ואתם לא תשוחחו. אז מה שאני מבקש זה ככה, בסבב הראשון, שכל אחד מדבר רבע שעה, יש שתי שאלות שאני הייתי רוצה לשאול. אחד זה שאלה היסטורית, עובדתית, והשאלה זה שאלה נורמטיבית. השאלה ההיסטורית, עד כמה משנתו של השל ביחס לנבואה ותובנותיו הנבואיות הפכו לחלק מהשיח ההלכתי. זו השאלה הראשונה. זאת אומרת, עובדות. והשאלה השנייה זה לדעתכם, מה אתם חושבים על עירובה של נבואה בתוך ההלכה? האם העירוב הזה הוא עירוב שמנוון את ההלכה, או משחית אותה, או מעוות אותה, או שבלעדי העירוב הזה ההלכה עתידה ליבול? זה הסבב הראשון. הסבב השני יעסוק בהקשרים של כאן ועכשיו, שהוא גם כן יהיה רבע שעה, וכל אחד מכם יגיב 5 דקות בשלב מסוים, ואז נפתח את זה לקהל, ואז הם יענו, ובחצות נלך הביתה.
אז אני פותח בהתנצלות ולא לנקות את זה מהזמן השמור. כוונתי הייתה לשאת את דבריי בעברית, אך מכמה סיבות החלטתי בסוף נגד מה שהייתה אצלי במחשבה תחילה. הסיבה העיקרית היא שאיאלץ לדון במושגים פילוסופיים מופשטים, ואני פשוט לא מסוגל לבצע את זה במידה הדרושה וכראוי להוגה כה חשוב כאברהם יהושע השל מבלעדי שפת האם שלי. לצורכנו פה התוכן עדיף על הצורה, ומלבד זה כמה וכמה ציטטות מכתבי השל ומחברים אחרים תהיינה בהכרח באנגלית, ובכן אעבור עכשיו ללא עזית ועמכם הסליחה. In the the first question very easy to answer because I served for 25 years on the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the conservative movement. There was never any prophetic cast to any discussions at the committee. And I will get back to this at the end, I promise. But for now, I will proceed to address the matter of whether it's legitimate at all to appeal to the prophetic in doing Jewish law. So, first a crucial note. I will, of course, be referring to Heschel's thought and writings, because I think they have strong implications for this question. However, we cannot know whether the man Heschel, were he still alive today, would assent to all of those implications that I'm going to draw. In this, the great thinker whom we honor with this conference is no better or worse position than any other thinker who has ever left us a record of his or her philosophy, because to write for others is to invite corollaries. And as for us devoted readers, it is our inalienable right, perhaps responsibility, to spell out those corollaries as they impress themselves on us, as long as we're careful to associate them with the ideas bequeathed to us, rather than to the person who bequeathed them. Now, to get to the subject at hand, I think we have to acknowledge the close connection between these implications concerning the prophetic and the halachic on the one hand, and the broader philosophical issue of metaphysical realism, or sometimes called Platonism, on the other. So there are several defining threshold questions that immediately present themselves. First, is there a real will of God that we are aspiring to fulfill or not? If there is not, and talk of the divine will is merely metaphorical or motivational, then prophecy is at bottom an illusion, and illusions should have no role to play in determining how we live. But if, on the other hand, there is a will of God that transcends us, then we have to ask ourselves a couple of further questions. So the second question is that will of God active and dynamic by virtue of God being involved with the world and affected by it? Or was the divine will expressed and fulfilled for all time by the revelation of the law by which we are to learn to live? If the second answer is accepted, then positivism in halakha is surely correct. That is, we posit what has come down to us as the record of revelation, that is the expression of the divine will, and we need never look to anything that transcends those posited postulates. Prophecy could have no practical normative role. But if we believe that the divine will is in a dynamic relation with the world, and with human action in particular, then positivism may not be justified unless and until we answer one further question. So here comes the third question. So if God's will is indeed real and is also in dynamic relation with human action, does God still actually wait for us to come seeking the divine will, the classic lidrosh et Adonai? Or has God, despite being profoundly affected by unfolding events in the world, nevertheless agreed to be satisfied with the modification of the quest for God formulated by the author of Ezra, that is, lidrosh et Torat Adonai? That we go searching in the texts and the authorized precedents, but not in any more direct apprehension of the divine will. So if that second response to this crucial question holds, then positivism is still correct. And I think that's the common, though I think stunted, interpretation of the Tanur Shalachnai tale, according to which God is constrained to assent to having been bested by the implications of God's own revelation. But what if instead we eschew that interpretation and recognize that the continuation of that tale actually depicts a God who is profoundly unhappy to the point of rage at the sages declining even to entertain the question of what God desires? That was Aaron's question to Moses, of course. Hayitav b'einei Adonai? If we choose that path, then it follows that we must ask ourselves, how can we justify a regime of substituting the law for God's will? Or more precisely, make the law a surrogate for the will of God? So these are the critical questions for our purposes here, and it is especially important to note, now that I've posed the questions, that Heschel's answers to all three of these questions were very definitive. Namely, he affirmed unabashedly that there is a real will of God that transcends us and our earthly formulations, and that means that attempts to capture the totality of the divine will in humanly accessible terms will always fall short. In addition, he asserted that the divine will is itself sensitive to what humans do in the world. And to be quite specific about Heschel here, he insisted that there is often a tension between God's will and the world by which God is affected. And finally, Heschel rather famously asserted that this tension is one that seeks expression and acknowledgement and that yearns for resolution. There is, as it were, a divine meta-will, namely the desire for us to be inquiring not just of God's Torah, but of the God who gave the Torah. In other words, Heschel was, with respect to God and the divine will, decidedly a realist. As I've put it elsewhere, as a sympathetic believer in the prophet's intuitive grasp of the divine reality lying beyond sense and reason, and even beyond Scripture itself, Heschel was one of the greatest of the latter-day religious Platonists. Now, the phrase beyond Scripture itself requires a few words. Scheiheld has recently insisted with respect to the celebrated phrase, as a report about revelation, the Bible itself is a midrash, that you recently heard in Hebrew translation. His insistence was that this phrase is independent of one's views about the origin of the words of the Torah. Its true import is to communicate to us that those words cannot convey a full understanding of that which is inherently ineffable. And indeed, this is what Heschel's work, Torah Min HaShamayim, asserts was the approach of what he called the Ishmaelian school, that the Torah, having been formulated in human language, cannot be taken to be an infallible roadmap to the divine reality, which must transcend all such formulations. And of course, Heschel makes the explicit declaration near the end of that long work that the times in which we live require the Ishmaelian approach more than ever. Domani shehasha'a tzricha lemishnato shel Rabbi Yishmael. These are the exact words. So again, as Held nicely puts it, Heschel is a signature example of a religious thinker who is a theological realist without being a theological literalist. That is, his warnings about the dangers of literal-mindedness are in no way meant to suggest that God or God's revelation is just a metaphor or a symbol for purely human realities or aspirations. So what is the connection between this divine will and the divine pathos, for that matter, and the status and role of prophecy. So Heschel was not a theoretical or sterile Platonist, by which I mean believer in a transcendent reality that is forever and in principle inaccessible. In his 1944 study on Sa'adya and the quest for certainty, he said quite succinctly that, this is a quote, "Not all that is evident is capable of being demonstrated." And that statement is actually logically equivalent to this one, which makes it a little clearer, I think. Not all that is incapable of being demonstrated is therefore incapable of being experienced. By the time he had finished his long process of studying the prophets, Heschel was ready to make the following statement about them. Even if the prophets had affirmed the essential unknowability of God, they would still have insisted on the possibility of understanding him by reflective intuition. And thus he expressed the essence of prophecy as the possibility of a grasp through a scientia intuitiva of a reality lying beyond our representations and our systematizations. So this crucial concept of intuition needs a few words. Here's how Rebecca Goldstein described the significance and effect of Platonism in mathematics. She wrote, "Our expressible knowledge is greater than our systems. The formalists had tried to certify mathematical certitude by eliminating intuitions, but it was shown that mathematics cannot proceed without them. Cannot proceed, that is, without intuitions of what is real and yet not given to full expression and demonstration by our humanly conceived and articulated systems." Now, different reasons may give rise to these mathematical convictions and the theological ones that we're dealing with here, but the parallels are striking and heuristically fruitful in demonstrating the intelligibility, if not the necessity, of Heschel's brand of realism. In Heschel's words, "It is a fact of profound significance that we sense more than we can say." And this is, in Heschel's conception, just what the prophets did. For what is his criterion for a prophetic insight? It is this, that the prophet goes beyond timeless norms to judge things by the powerfully intuited God's point of view. Prophecy proclaims what happened to God as well as what will happen to the people. You know, we think of prophecy as saying, predicting what's going to happen to the people, and Heschel says it's what has already happened to God. In judging human affairs, it unfolds a divine situation. What happened to God, because there is often a tension between God's will and human behavior, and this, together with all that has been established about the shortfalls of human language and reason to capture the divine will, implies the most crucial point of all, and that is that there can be a significant discrepancy between even the best systematization of religious truth and the reality of the divine itself. And that happens when the best, most conscientious fidelity to legal procedure nevertheless yields a result that one senses, intuits, would give God profound sadness. In Torah Min HaShamayim, Heschel quotes the study hall prayer that is attributed by the Mishnah to Nechunya ben Hakanah, "Shelo ye'ara takala al yadi v'lo ekashel bidvar halakha." The context there, in a chapter called Ashrei HaMachmirin, which is a kind of a sarcastic title, makes it clear that Heschel's understanding of Shelo ekashel bidvar halakha is not as pointing to possible errors in applying the halachic rules and the precedents, but rather to errors in what he calls shikul hadat, which I think means quite literally how we assign weights to the different authorities to which we are responsible. Do our sacred formulations crowd out and eclipse our equally sacred intuitions? So he says in God in the Search of Man, heavenly wisdom is more profound than what the Torah contains in its present form. Prophecy is superior to human wisdom, and God's love is superior even to prophecy. This is reminiscent of Buber's statement in Reflecting, was a well-known snippet on the story of Samuel and Agag, that even Samuel, the prophet, let alone Scripture, may have gotten it wrong, and that a faithful Jew must always seek, if need be, to choose God over the Bible. And Heschel himself made such a statement less than a year before his death. in addressing the World Zionist Congress here in Jerusalem in February of 1972. He said, "Yes, we are commanded to love Torah, but we are also told to love God. Today, there are those whose love of Torah threatens to supplant their love of God." So now comes the $64,000 question. Isn't the prophetic mode of appealing to what the divine will must be, or more likely to what we feel it cannot be, isn't that less verifiable, less steady, less stable than halakha determined by canonized texts and recorded precedent? And the answer is, of course it is. And not surprisingly, Heschel himself recognized this when he wrote that in the third volume of Torah Min HaShamayim, Kol hadrachim bechezkat sakana. All roads are dangerous, whichever one you choose. But there is a crucial point to be raised here which greatly ameliorates the fear of a slippery, out-of-control relativism. Because in speaking of a prophetic mode, we should be clear, we are no longer talking about a single person, perhaps wearing a loincloth and nothing else, who is tossing at us a proclamation that arises from his or her own private language. For there is such a thing as intersubjective or collective intuition. V'chol ha'am rawim et hakolot. It is those intersubjective convergences of religious intuitions about God's will that have historically created religiously connected communities to begin with. After the September 11th attacks, when there were those who claimed that the indeterminacies of postmodernism left us with no basis at all for condemning terrorist attacks or for fighting back, Stanley Fish noted this crucial thing. He said that at times like these, the nation rightly falls back on the record of aspiration and accomplishment that makes up our collective understanding of what we live for, and that understanding is sufficient. These understandings, these collective intersubjective understandings, which have real weight in people's lives, must, I submit, have weight in religious philosophy and practice as well. So I promised I would return at the very end to what did not happen in my 25 years on that law committee. Well, actually, I returned to what did happen. Repeatedly on many different issues, and you heard this from Avinouam in Hebrew, colleagues said to and of one another that their hearts and emotions were deeply saddened at the human pain that the law clearly required, but the precedents were too solidly entrenched to do otherwise. In Heschelian terms, they were saying that they had a powerful and collective intuition that something was happening to God in seeing the pain inflicted by the law, and yet they were handcuffed by their belief that true fidelity demanded that those prophetic-like intuitions of the divine will could have no standing in their court. So just as Heschel said about Yishmael, to say, having studied Heschel's thought, Domani sha'at tzricha lemishnato shel Avraham Yehושע Heschel, that the hour we live in demands the implications of Heschel's teaching regarding the principle of prophetic intuition, some might even say, particularly in a Jewish state, struggling with what God would want of it and of us. Thank you.